General comments on the papers, because they're all concerning extremism, and some are also talking about violence, violent manifestations of extremism. So I'd like to make some comments, some general comments, and a suggestion at the end about how this is connected to Nursi studies. First of all, on the definition of extremism. Now, extremism, as we were to define it objectively, has to do with the failure to establish a balance between extremes. And in Islamic terminology, we talk about ifrat and tafrit. These are two extremes. Yeah? Now, in that case, non-extremism is what is called wasatiyya, or moderation, and we can also understand moderation in terms of justice, in terms of the establishment of justice, because justice in the Quran is defined as mizan, as balance, right? And when you have a balance, it means you are establishing a balance between extremes. This is what balance means. Now, how do we define extremism? For example, terrorism as a form of as a manifestation of extremism. How do we define it in terms of our definition of extremism? So we could say that the ideology underlying terrorism is extremist because it is a result of the failure to establish a balance between inclusivism and exclusivism. Because the ideology of terrorism is based on an exclusivist orientation. You are so much against a particular group that they have no right to exist, and they should be, obliterated. They should be extinguished. Now, a more moderate view would be that you do not agree with the ideology or the thinking of a particular group, but you accept their existence in your society. A very moderate view would be that you do not agree with their views, but you embrace them and you even love them, perhaps. Now, being extremist on the other side, if you are extremist in the sense of being inclusivist, totally inclusivist, that's also a form of extremism. A group that, let's say, does not accept the basic tenets of Islam, but claim to be Muslims, and you uncritically adopt them, regard them as part of Islamic society, and so on and so forth. That would also be extremist. Now, there are other forms of extremism that are not based on the failure to establish the balance between inclusivism and exclusivism. For example, we often speak about legalism in Islam, that how certain groups are excessively devoted to following the letter of the law. Here you have extremism in the sense of the failure to establish a balance between the need to follow the law, to follow the Sharia on the one hand, and the need to have the spiritual experience on the other hand. To preach an understanding of Islam based on following the Sharia while neglecting the idea of spiritual experience is a form of extremism. On the other hand, to say that Islam is just about spiritual experience and we may dispense with the law, with the Sharia, with the rituals, is also a form of extremism. So the point is, we are defining extremism in terms of the failure to establish balance between two extremes. But what those extremes are depends on what we are talking about. If we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about physical violence, we're talking about inclusivism versus exclusivism. But we may speak about other forms of extremism, in which case there will be different dichotomies that we talk about. In the second example I gave, it is really the dichotomy Zahir-Batin dichotomy, and so on and so forth. In fact, in some work I have done in the past, I have listed about 7 or 8 dichotomies which collectively define extremism. Now, why am I saying this? It is necessary to have a definition in order that we may speak objectively about these problems. In this case, extremism. Now I want to come to the causes of violence. Now, it is a frequent. It is frequently said by Muslims that extremists or terrorists engage in terrorist acts because they misunderstand Islam. They misunderstand the Quran, for example. This cannot be further from the truth. In fact, I would argue that terrorism has got nothing to do with misunderstanding the Quran or misunderstanding Islam. If that were the case, it's just a matter of correcting their understanding, and then people will not be terrorists. But it is not as simple as that. Terrorists, or people who believe in perpetrating violent actions against others, have this orientation for several reasons. First of all, there is a psychological predisposition towards violence. There is actually a lack of compassion that is, which underlies their orientation. There are, of course, many other factors, the external factors, which may push people towards violent acts. But this, again, is not a major factor, because the vast majority of people in the state of poverty are not prone to violence. Right? So we need actually to be more careful in terms of how we assess the causes of extremism. But we can say, of course, in general, that there are external and there are internal factors. There are factors external to Muslim society, the role of superpowers, etc., etc. We all know the story about how the US were involved in the directly or indirectly in the creation of the Taliban. The Russians also, probably the Russians are the main cause, because they are the ones who invaded Afghanistan. And then US involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, their involvement in fomenting sectarian conflict between different groups. We know these things. But we also have to be very critical about our own tradition, because there is much in our own tradition which contributes to violence. This is where we have to be critical, and we have to be fair. Criticizing the US is important. The US is a menace. Definitely, we agree with that. The Russians are a menace. Our own governments are a menace in many cases. But what about our own tradition? Now, I'd like to give you some examples. In the khutbahs, in many countries, in many mosques, we preach, the Imam would say, Fansurna ala, and then they will say a long list of, Christians, Jews, and this, and then Shiites also, nowadays they are saying, and so on and so forth. Now, what do you think of that? Can you say Fansurna ala Yahudi, for example? If you believe the Jews are, I'm not talking about Zionists, I'm talking about Jews. Or if you believe Jews and Christians are our mortal enemies, yeah, then you say that. But is it correct to say that? Is it correct to designate the Jews and the Christians as a people, as the enemies of Islam? Now, let me give you another example. Kind of misogynist view. the view that women without hijab are prone to be raped, are more prone to sexual violence. This is said by many ulama. This is, in fact, an idea based on ignorance. Any undergraduate sociology student knows that rape has nothing to do with how a woman looks. Rape has nothing to do with whether a woman dresses provocatively or dresses with hijab, or whether a woman is beautiful or ugly by the standards of society, because all kinds of women are raped. With hijab, without hijab, old women, young women. Rape has to do with power. It has to do with the inferiority complex of the man, and so on and so forth. Nothing to do with how a woman looks. Right? But when you say women who are not using hijab or are dressed in a provocative way are more prone to rape, in a sense you are justifying the rape, because you are blaming the woman for the rape, which is very wrong and extremely irresponsible for ulama, for muftis, for imams to say this. So there are, but I want to give just one last example about this, right? About these issues. We have, this is kind of a general point here. We have a problem of hate speech among Muslims. And hate speech has a direct relationship with violence. Even if the hate speech is not perpetrated by people who believe in violence, but it can result in violence. I myself have been studying anti-Shiite hate speech. But we have hate speech among Sunnis. We have hate speech among, for example, nowadays in various countries, hate speech against feminists who are Sunni, hate speech against Islamic feminists, hate speech against liberals, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure in other contexts you will have one group, maybe Deobandis against Barelwis, and so on and so forth. So I want to just give an example of how hatred can be the result of a misunderstanding about tradition. You know, the story of the Prophet having agreed to the execution of 900 men of the Bani Qurayza. Right? I don't have time to go into all the details, but basically the Jewish tribe of the Bani Qurayza in Medina, it was said to the Prophet that they had went against their agreement to live in peace with the Muslims, and that they cooperated with the Quraysh when the Quraysh came to fight. This is at the battle of the Khandaq. Right? At the end there was hardly any battle. A handful of people were probably killed, and it's not known how many of the men of the Bani Qurayza fought. Most likely some of them did, but certainly not all of them. But still, all of the men of the Bani Qurayza were killed, were executed, and their wives and children sold as slaves. This is the story. This is the story. But there are some scholars, including myself, who do not believe that the story, that events took place as told by the story. Because in Islam, there is no such thing as collective punishment. If 3 or 4 Jews went against the agreement and against the Prophet's agreement, the Prophet would not have agreed to the killing of the whole tribe, right? The whole group. Yet the story is uncritically handed down from generation to generation, and the story is actually, there's only one source for the story, by the way, so that already suggests that there are reasons for us to doubt its veracity. But that's another matter. We can go into the details as to why there are problems with the story. For example, one interesting point is that the Jewish sources that we have on the life of the Prophet never mention this event. Surely the Jews who were living in the time of the Prophet would have mentioned this. There are some Jewish sources used by Muslims to construct the seerah of the Prophet. None of those contemporary Jewish sources mention this event. But anyway, my point is this. This killing of the entire tribe of the Bani Qurayza is often used by Muslims to justify an anti-Jewish position. More recently, a few years ago, a Russian ISIS fighter in Islamic Daesh, a Russian Daesh fighter said to the Muslims, "Why are you criticizing us, Daesh? Why are you criticizing us for killing Christians? The Prophet killed the entire Jewish tribe," talking about the Bani Qurayza. "So why are you against us killing Christians?" This is how these things in our tradition are used in a negative way. Therefore, when we talk about racism, when we talk about extremism, when we talk about terrorism, we need to be balanced in our approach between talking about the external factors, the role of non-Muslims and so on and so forth, the role of other kinds of external factors like poverty, totalitarianism, dictatorships in our countries. These are all true. But there are also things in our tradition which combine with these external factors and may result in violence. In Singapore, a few years last year, 2 people were detained by the security forces for attempting to go to Syria to join ISIS. And they said that their reason, one of them said that he wanted to go to ISIS to kill Shiites. Now, to what extent is the hate speech, anti-Shiite hate speech going on in social media in Singapore responsible for his decision? We have to take that seriously. The problem is we Muslims are never outraged at hate speech. We are never, angry at hate speech against fellow Muslims. So now I'm going to, you're getting ready to write the note. Yeah. So when we talk about racism, we have a problem of Judeophobia. So we complain about Islamophobia, but there is also Judeophobia. Although it is quite recent in Islamic history, probably 20th century, a lot to do with the formation of the State of Israel. But we have a problem of Judeophobia. And aspects of our tradition, like the story of the Bani Qurayza, would tend to contribute to that. So this is why we must be concerned with tradition. I just want to make a note, a short note here about terminology. I was checking with Dr. Hakan about the term that Nursi used for nationalism. I myself have read what Nursi discussed about nationalism, but I didn't have the opportunity to check the Turkish original. And Hakan said it is milliyet Chilik. Yeah. Now, and this I suspected it would have been that, because it's not really entirely correct to translate that as nationalism. Because when you say nationalism, you're talking about a modern context of the nation state. It's more correct to refer to milliyet Chilik as a kind of group parochialism, referring to the parochialism of a particular group, whether that group is a tribal group or a religious group or an ethnic group. So if you're talking about a millet as a religious group, that group can have a kind of parochialism. If you are talking about the millet as a clan, like when Nursi spoke about the Bani Umayyah as being nationalistic, then you're talking about the group as a tribe or a clan. So this is just a point about the need to be accurate about terminology. Otherwise, we use terms in an anachronistic way. When we say nationalism, as if there was a notion of nationalism in the past. Now, to end, where does Nursi come in as far as we're talking about racism, extremism, terrorism, and so on? Now, of course, we can look at Nursi's text to see what he says about racism, to see what he says about nationalism, to see what he says about violence, and so on and so forth. Now, the chances are that whatever Nursi has to say about these things are not going to be very instructive. Now, I'm not criticizing Nursi here. What I'm saying is, if Nursi calls on us to be compassionate, this is a right thing to do, and it's something we accept, right? But the lesson that we ought to draw from Nursi is not that we need to be compassionate, because it is a lesson that we ought to know anyway. If Nursi calls on us to respect, fellow brothers, Muslims as brothers, or fellow human beings in humanity, we agree with that call. But that is not the lesson that we need to derive from Nursi, because these are self-evident. The challenge for me would be: is it possible to develop a theory of non-violent resistance from Nursi? That would be the challenge, to extract a doctrine of non-violent resistance, which would be something useful to educate people, to educate our youth, so that they grow up, with a different kind of orientation. And in that respect, it's interesting to look at Nursi in comparison to the contemporary Syrian writer Chowdhury Syed. Chowdhury Syed is a follower of Iqbal and Malik bin Nabi, and he espouses a theory of non-violence. He says that Islam is fundamentally non-violent, and he takes a very strong position. And taking his position would amount to saying that many of the wars of conquest and the establishment of dynasties in Islamic history were actually unjust, un-Islamic. So where does Nursi fall? Definitely Nursi is not a preacher of violence, that's for sure. But where does Nursi fall in terms of the whole idea of non-violence or non-violent resistance? I think that would be our challenge as far as today's topics are concerned. Thank you very much.